On April 19, 1824, in a rain-soaked military camp in Missolonghi, Greece, a man who had survived scandal, exile, and the condemnation of an entire nation, died at 36, shivering and delirious, his blood drained by the very doctors who were trying to save him. He had not died in a duel, not in the arms of a lover, not dramatically as the legend demanded, but slowly, painfully, in a muddy Greek town at the edge of a war that wasn't even his. Lord Byron, the most famous man in Europe, the poet who had made women faint and governments tremble, died whispering the names of people he would never see again. Yet to remember Byron only in his final hours is to miss the most outrageous, scandalous, and electrically alive human being the literary world has ever produced. A man who kept a pet bear in his university dormitory, who was driven out of England in disgrace, who loved too many people, too recklessly, and never once apologized for any of it. This is the story of George Gordon Byron, and it begins long before that rainy night in Greece. George Gordon Byron was born on January 22, 1788, in a modest rented room on Holles Street in London. His father was Captain John Byron, a man known throughout society by the fitting moniker Mad Jack. Mad Jack was a handsome, charming, and utterly profligate former army officer whose primary occupation was seducing wealthy women and squandering their fortunes. He had previously eloped with the married Marchioness of Carmarthen, ruining her reputation and spending her money before she died. For his second act, he targeted Catherine Gordon of Guyte, a proud, volatile Scottish heiress who traced her lineage back to King James I of Scotland. Catherine was captivated by Mad Jack's charm, but the marriage was a disaster from the start. Within a few short years, Mad Jack had systematically drained Catherine's considerable estate, selling off her lands and leaving her virtually penniless. By the time George was born, the family was dodging creditors. Shortly after the birth, Catherine, humiliated and destitute, retreated to Aberdeen, Scotland, with her infant son. Mad Jack followed briefly, but the marriage was effectively over. He soon fled to France to escape his debts, where he died in 1791, likely by his own hand or from the ravages of tuberculosis, when young George was just 3 years old. The boy was left in the sole care of his mother, a woman whose temperament was as stormy as the Scottish weather. Catherine Gordon was fiercely protective of her son, but she was also prone to violent, unpredictable rages. She would smother him with affection one moment and hurl objects at him the next, famously calling him a lame brat in her fits of anger. This volatile environment instilled in Byron a deep-seated insecurity and a lifelong ambivalence toward women, a pattern of intense attachment followed by sudden, destructive withdrawal that would characterize all his future relationships. The insult, lame brat, cut to the very core of Byron's existence, for he was born with a physical deformity that would haunt him until his dying day: a clubfoot. His right foot was twisted inward, forcing him to walk with a pronounced sliding limp. In an era when physical perfection was highly prized among the aristocracy, this deformity was a source of agonizing shame. His mother subjected him to a series of painful, ineffective medical treatments, including agonizing metal braces designed to straighten the limb. The physical pain was immense, but the psychological scarring was far worse. Byron's clubfoot made him acutely self-conscious, driving him to overcompensate in other areas. He developed a fierce, almost reckless physical courage, becoming an expert swimmer, a skilled horseman, and a formidable boxer. He was determined to prove that his physical limitation did not diminish his masculinity or his aristocratic pride. Yet the limp remained a constant, humiliating reminder of his vulnerability. He later wrote, "I am a poor creature who never could learn to walk, but who can swim like a fish." The trauma of Byron's childhood was deepened by the conduct of his nursemaid, May Gray. With his mother, Catherine Gordon, frequently absent or lost in her own turbulent emotions, Gray became the dominant presence in the boy's daily life, and a deeply damaging one. Biographers now broadly agree that Grace subjected the young Byron to serious mistreatment. She ridiculed his physical condition, treated him with cruelty, and exposed him to experiences entirely inappropriate for a child his age. Experiences that, as Byron himself later acknowledged to confidants, left lasting psychological wounds. This profound corruption of his formative years left a permanent mark on his relationship with intimacy, planting the seeds of the restless, often self-destructive patterns that would come to define his adult life. Despite the poverty and the abuse, Byron was a voracious reader. He devoured history, mythology, and the Bible, finding solace and escape in the grand narratives of the past. He was particularly drawn to stories of fallen heroes and tragic destinies, themes that would later become the bedrock of his own poetry. His early education in Aberdeen was erratic, but his fierce intelligence was undeniable. Then, in 1798, when George was 10 years old, the trajectory of his life changed overnight. His great-uncle, William Byron, the 5th Baron Byron, died without a direct heir. William was known locally as the Wicked Lord, a reclusive, violent man who had killed a relative in a duel and allowed the family's ancestral estate, Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, to fall into ruin. Upon his death, the title and the heavily mortgaged estate passed to young George. The lame brat of Aberdeen was suddenly George Gordon, the 6th Baron Byron. Catherine Gordon proudly brought her son south to claim his inheritance. The site of Newstead Abbey, a sprawling, decaying former Augustinian priory surrounded by overgrown gardens and a dark lake, left a profound impression on the young lord. It was a Gothic ruin, a physical manifestation of his family's dark, violent history. Though they could not afford to live there immediately, Newstead became the spiritual home of his imagination, a place of ghosts, shadows, and aristocratic decay. With his new title came the expectation of a gentleman's education. In 1801, Byron was sent to Harrow School, one of England's most prestigious public schools. His arrival at Harrow was rocky. He was fiercely proud of his title, but deeply insecure about his limp, his Scottish accent, and his lack of formal classical training. He initially rebelled against the strict discipline and the bullying of the older boys. However, Byron soon found his footing at Harrow. His sharp wit, physical courage, and natural charisma earned him the respect and admiration of his peers. He cultivated deep, emotionally charged friendships, bonds of extraordinary intensity and devotion that would prove characteristic of his nature throughout his life, and that hinted at the complexity of his inner emotional world. He also revealed a gift for public speaking and the composition of verse. It was at Harrow that Byron first began to shape the identity that would later captivate the world, that of the brilliant, brooding, and rebellious aristocrat. It was also during his Harrow years that he experienced his first profound, agonizing heartbreak. During the summer holidays of 1803, he fell desperately in love with Mary Chaworth, a distant cousin who lived near Newstead Abbey. Mary was older, already engaged, and entirely dismissive of the lame boy who followed her around with dog-like devotion. When Byron overheard her telling her maid, "Do you think I could care anything for that lame boy?" he was devastated. He fled the house in the middle of the night, the rejection searing itself into his soul. Mary Chaworth became the unattainable ideal, the morning star of Annesley, a figure of lost innocence that he would mourn in his poetry for the rest of his life. By the time Byron left Harrow in 1805 to attend Trinity College, Cambridge, the mould was set. He was a young man of immense talent and profound contradictions. He was an aristocrat who despised authority, a romantic who was deeply cynical about love, and a man driven by a desperate need for affection yet terrified of vulnerability. The wicked blood of the Byrons and the volatile temper of the Gordons coursed through his veins, fueled by the traumas of his childhood and the agonizing shame of his deformity. He was poised to enter the adult world, armed with a brilliant mind, a devastating wit, and a burgeoning poetic genius. But the demons of his past were always waiting in the wings. As we move into Chapter 2, we will follow Byron to Cambridge, where he would fully embrace the excesses of aristocratic life, publish his first collections of poetry, and embark on a grand, dangerous tour of the Mediterranean that would provide the raw material for his spectacular rise to fame. In the autumn of 1805, George Gordon, the 6th Baron Byron, arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge. He was 17 years old, fiercely intelligent, deeply insecure, and determined to make his mark on the world. Cambridge, with its ancient spires and traditions of aristocratic privilege, provided the perfect stage for Byron to cultivate the persona he had begun to develop at Harrow. He was no longer the bullied, lame boy of Aberdeen. He was a lord, and he intended to live like one regardless of the fact that his estate was heavily mortgaged and his income meagre. Byron's time at Cambridge was characterized less by academic rigor and more by spectacular, calculated excess. He plunged into a life of drinking, gambling, and sexual experimentation. He formed a close circle of friends, most notably John Cam Hobhouse, a pragmatic and loyal companion who would remain a stabilizing force throughout Byron's chaotic life. Together, they engaged in the typical debaucheries of wealthy undergraduates, but Byron always pushed things further. His most famous act of rebellion at Cambridge was a direct challenge to the university's strict rules. When he was informed that dogs were not permitted in the college dormitories, Byron, with characteristic theatricality, purchased a tame bear and brought it to live in his rooms. When the authorities protested, he calmly pointed out that the college statutes explicitly forbade dogs, but made no mention whatsoever of bears. He even suggested he might apply for a fellowship for the animal. It was a brilliant, absurd gesture that perfectly encapsulated his contempt for arbitrary authority and his desire to shock the establishment. Beyond the drinking and the bear, Cambridge was also a period of profound emotional awakening for Byron. He formed deeply intimate and passionate bonds with younger men, most notably a choir boy named John Edelston, whose voice had first caught his attention in the Trinity College chapel. These relationships, tender and consuming, echoed the intense attachments he had first known at Harrow. In the rigidly moralistic climate of early 19th century England, where such bonds carried grave legal consequences, they were kept in careful shadow. Private chapters in a life that was already pulling hard against every boundary society had drawn. It was also during his Cambridge years that Byron began to take his poetry seriously. In 1806, he privately printed a small volume of verses titled Fugitive Pieces, which he quickly suppressed and destroyed after a friend objected to the erotic nature of one of the poems. Undeterred, he revised and expanded the collection, publishing it publicly in 1807 under the title Hours of Idleness. Hours of Idleness was a collection of relatively conventional, romantic verses, heavily influenced by the prevailing tastes of the time. It was the work of a talented but immature poet, full of melancholy posturing and aristocratic entitlement. The critical reception was largely indifferent until the powerful and feared Edinburgh Review published a scathing critique by Henry Brougham, a lawyer, politician, and one of the journal's most formidable contributors. Brougham mocked Byron's youth, his aristocratic pretensions, and the derivative nature of his verse, dismissing the collection as the self-indulgent effusions of a titled nobleman and implying he would do well to abandon poetry altogether. The review was a devastating blow to Byron's fragile ego, but it also ignited his fierce, combative spirit. Instead of retreating, he retaliated with a vengeance. He spent the next year crafting a brilliant, vitriolic satirical poem titled English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, published anonymously in 1809. In this blistering satire, modelled on the works of Alexander Pope, Byron attacked not only the critics of the Edinburgh Review, but almost every major literary figure of the day, including William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Sir Walter Scott. He skewered their pretensions, their politics, and their poetic styles with devastating wit and precision. English bards and Scotch reviewers was a sensation. It went through multiple editions and established Byron not as a melancholy romantic, but as a formidable, dangerous satirist. He had proven that he could fight back, and that his pen was as sharp as any sword. However, the success of his satire did not solve his mounting problems. By 1809, Byron was deeply in debt, hounded by creditors and restless. He had taken his seat in the House of Lords, but found the political arena dull and hypocritical. He needed an escape, a grand adventure that would take him far from the suffocating constraints of English society. In July 1809, accompanied by his loyal friend Hobhouse and a small retinue of servants, Byron embarked on a grand tour. But unlike the typical aristocratic tour, which focused on the civilized capitals of France and Italy, Byron's journey took him to the wild, dangerous, and exotic fringes of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. The Napoleonic Wars had closed off much of Western Europe, so Byron sailed for Portugal and Spain, then on to Malta, Albania, Greece, and Turkey. This journey was the crucible that forged the mature poet. The landscapes he encountered: the rugged mountains of Albania, the sun-drenched ruins of Greece, the bustling, exotic streets of Constantinople, profoundly stimulated his imagination. He was captivated by the stark contrast between the glorious, mythic past of these regions and their present state of decay and subjugation under Ottoman rule. In Albania, he was hosted by the ruthless and powerful warlord Ali Pasha. Byron was fascinated by the brutal masculine culture of the Albanian Highlanders, their colourful dress, and their fierce independence. He saw in them a reflection of his own rebellious spirit. He wrote to his mother, "I like the Albanians much. They are not all Turks. Some tribes are Christians, but their religion makes little difference in their manner or conduct." It was in Greece, however, that Byron found his true spiritual home. He was deeply moved by the tragic beauty of the ruined temples and the plight of the Greek people, who were struggling under the yoke of the Ottoman Empire. He began to view himself not just as an observer, but as a participant in their struggle for freedom. During his time in the East, Byron also engaged in acts of physical bravado that would become legendary. The most famous of these occurred in May 1810, when he swam across the Hellespont, the Dardanelles Strait, the treacherous body of water separating Europe and Asia. He undertook the swim to emulate the mythical Greek hero Leander, who swam the strait nightly to visit his lover Hero. Despite his clubfoot, Byron completed the grueling swim in just over an hour, a feat of endurance that he boasted about for the rest of his life. He later immortalized the event in a poem, writing, "He could, perhaps, have passed the Hellespont, as once, a feat on which ourselves we prided, Leander, Mr. Ekenhead, and I did." Throughout his travels, Byron was writing. He was composing a long, sprawling narrative poem that chronicled the journey of a world-weary, cynical young nobleman who wanders through the exotic landscapes of the Mediterranean, seeking distraction from his own inner demons. The poem was a thinly veiled autobiography, a travelogue infused with melancholy, political commentary, and a profound sense of alienation. He called it Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Byron returned to England in July 1811 after 2 years abroad. He was 23 years old, deeply tanned, and carrying a trunk full of manuscripts, including the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold. His return, however, was marred by tragedy. Within weeks of his arrival, his mother, Catherine Gordon, died suddenly. Despite their volatile relationship, her death was a profound shock. Shortly thereafter, he received news that several of his closest friends from Cambridge, including the choirboy John Edelston, had also died. Grief-stricken and isolated, Byron retreated to the decaying halls of Newstead Abbey. He felt that he was cursed, that everyone he loved was destined to die young. He wrote to a friend, "Some curse hangs over me and mine. My mother lies a corpse in this house. One of my best friends is drowned in a ditch." Yet amidst this profound despair, the the seeds of his greatest triumph had already been sown. He handed the manuscript of Childe Harold's pilgrimage to his friend and literary agent, Robert Charles Dallas. Dallas recognized immediately that the poem was something entirely new and extraordinary. He arranged for its publication with the prestigious firm of John Murray. As 1811 drew to a close, Byron was a grieving, debt-ridden young lord, living in a ruined abbey, unaware that the manuscript he had brought back from the East was about to detonate like a bomb in the heart of London society. As we move into Chapter 3, we will witness the explosion of Childe Harold, the creation of the Byronic Hero, and the unprecedented, intoxicating, and ultimately destructive wave of fame that would sweep Byron up and change his life forever. On February 27, 1812, Byron delivered his maiden speech in the House of Lords. It was a passionate, eloquent defence of the Luddites, impoverished weavers in Nottinghamshire who were breaking the new mechanised looms that were destroying their livelihoods. The government had proposed the Frame Breaking Act, which would make the destruction of machines a capital offence punishable by death. Byron, drawing on his own observations of the desperate poverty in his home county, argued vehemently against the draconian measure. "Is there not blood enough upon your penal code," he thundered, "that more must be poured forth to ascend to heaven and testify against you?" The speech was brilliant, theatrical, and entirely unsuccessful in stopping the bill, but it marked Byron as a man of radical sympathies and undeniable rhetorical power. However, it was not his politics that would make him immortal. Just a few days later, on March 10, 1812, the publisher John Murray released the first 2 cantos of Childe Harold's pilgrimage. The impact was instantaneous and unprecedented. The first edition sold out in 3 days. Subsequent editions were printed and devoured by a public hungry for something new. Byron later summarized the experience with a phrase that has become legendary: "I awoke one morning and found myself famous." Childe Harold's pilgrimage was unlike anything the British public had ever read. It was a travelogue, yes, but it was also a deeply personal, psychological exploration of a new kind of protagonist. Childe Harold was a young nobleman, sated with the pleasures of the world, burdened by a mysterious, unspoken guilt, who wanders through the exotic landscapes of the Mediterranean seeking distraction and solace. He was cynical, melancholic, defiant, and irresistibly attractive. In Childe Harold, Byron had inadvertently created the archetype that would bear his name, the Byronic Hero. This figure, dark, brooding, fiercely independent, possessing a troubled past and a magnetic, almost dangerous charisma, would dominate 19th century literature, influencing everyone from the Bronte sisters to Alexander Pushkin. The public naturally assumed that Childe Harold was simply Lord Byron in a thin disguise. Byron denied it, but the line between the poet and his creation was hopelessly blurred. The publication of Childe Harold transformed Byron from an obscure lord into the most sought-after man in London. He was suddenly the darling of the Whig aristocracy, invited to every exclusive salon, ball, and dinner party. Women threw themselves at him, captivated by his pale, striking features, his dark, curling hair, and the aura of tragic romance that surrounded him. Even his clubfoot, which he had so long despised, was now seen as a romantic affliction and a physical manifestation of his wounded soul. Byron plunged into the glittering, superficial world of Regency London with reckless abandon. He was a master of the social game, deploying his devastating wit and his undeniable charm to conquer the highest echelons of society. But the fame was intoxicating, and the adulation was a dangerous drug for a man already prone to excess and self-destruction. It was in this fevered atmosphere that Byron embarked on the most notorious and destructive affair of his life. In the spring of 1812, he was introduced to Lady Caroline Lamb, the wife of William Lamb, the future Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, and a prominent figure in Whig society. Lady Caroline was eccentric, highly strung, and fiercely intelligent. Before she even met Byron, she had read Childe Harold and famously declared him mad, bad, and dangerous to know. When they finally met, the attraction was explosive. Their affair was the scandal of the season. It was passionate, public, and entirely lacking in discretion. Lady Caroline, who liked to dress in men's clothing and engage in theatrical displays of emotion, pursued Byron with a relentless, suffocating intensity. She sent him locks of her pubic hair, forged his handwriting to obtain his portrait, and even staged a dramatic bloody scene with a knife at a society ball when he tried to distance himself from her. For Byron, who valued his independence above all else, Lady Caroline's obsessive devotion quickly turned from flattering to terrifying. He felt trapped, suffocated by her demands and her public hysterics. He began to withdraw, seeking refuge in the arms of other women. The affair ended bitterly, with Lady Caroline burning him in effigy and later publishing a thinly veiled, scandalous novel titled Glenarvan, in which Byron was depicted as a demonic, seductive villain. Seeking a more stable and discreet liaison, Byron turned his attentions to Jane Harley, the Countess of Oxford. Lady Oxford was older, sophisticated, and a veteran of numerous aristocratic affairs. She provided Byron with a temporary haven from the madness of Lady Caroline Lamb and the relentless pressures of his newfound fame. Under her influence, Byron's political views became even more radical, and he enjoyed a brief period of relative domestic tranquility at her country estate. Yet, even as he navigated these complex romantic entanglements, Byron continued to write. He was a literary phenomenon, and the public demanded more. He began to produce a series of Oriental tales, fast-paced, exotic narrative poems that capitalized on the public's fascination with the East and the brooding, dangerous archetype he had created in Childe Harold. As 1813 drew to a close, Lord Byron was at the absolute zenith of his popularity. He was the most famous poet in the world, a cultural icon whose every move was scrutinized and imitated. He had conquered London society, but the victory was hollow. He was deeply cynical about the adulation he received, recognizing the hypocrisy and the fickleness of the aristocratic world that now worshipped him. He wrote in his journal, "I have been the idol of the day, and I know what it is to be idolized. It is to be a target for every fool to shoot at." The fame that had elevated him was also a trap, a gilded cage that he was increasingly desperate to escape. The pressure to maintain the persona of the Byronic hero, the constant scrutiny of his private life, and his own restless, self-destructive nature were pushing him toward a crisis. As we move into Chapter 4, we will see how Byron's desperate search for stability led him into a disastrous marriage, and how a dark, unspeakable scandal involving his own family would ultimately destroy his reputation and drive him into permanent exile. Drawing heavily on his experiences during his grand tour of the Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire, Byron crafted stories that were exotic, fast-paced, and dripping with dark romance. The first of these, The Giaour, 1813, is a fragmented, haunting tale of a Christian infidel, the Giaour, who falls in love with Layla, a member of a Turkish pasha's harem. When their affair is discovered, Layla is thrown into the sea to drown, and the Giaour exacts a bloody revenge before retreating to a monastery to die in unrepentant agony. The poem introduced a more violent, active version of the Byronic hero, a man driven by passions so intense they destroy everything around him. He followed this rapidly with The Bride of Abydos, 1813, a tragic story of forbidden love between Zuleika and Selim, who believe themselves to be brother and sister. The theme of incestuous love, though ultimately revealed to be a misunderstanding in the poem, was a dangerous and provocative subject that hinted at the dark secrets brewing in Byron's own life. In 1814, he published The Corsair, the story of Conrad, a pirate chief who is ruthless to his enemies but fiercely loyal to his beloved Medora. The Corsair was an absolute sensation, selling an astonishing 10,000 copies on its first day of publication, a feat unheard of in the history of publishing. The public was mesmerized by Conrad, a man described as having one virtue and 1,000 crimes. Byron concluded this cycle with Lara, 1814, a darker, more psychological sequel to The Corsair, focusing on the protagonist's return to his ancestral home and his inability to escape his violent past. These Oriental tales cemented Byron's reputation and filled his empty coffers, but they also served as a smokescreen for a private life that was spiraling out of control. Beneath the glittering surface of his fame, Byron had embarked on an affair that was not merely scandalous, but socially and legally ruinous. He had fallen deeply, obsessively in love with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. Augusta was the daughter of Mad Jack Byron from his first marriage. She and Byron had grown up apart and barely knew each other until they reconnected as adults. Augusta was warm, maternal, and entirely lacking in the intellectual pretensions of the society women who threw themselves at Byron. She accepted him unconditionally, flaws and all. For Byron, who had always felt like an outsider, Augusta felt like home. He wrote to her with a desperate, almost terrifying intensity, declaring, "My dearest Augusta, I have never ceased to love you. You are the only comfort of my life." The exact nature of their relationship has been debated by historians, but the overwhelming consensus, supported by Byron's own thinly veiled letters and poems, is that it was incestuous. In the spring of 1814, Augusta gave birth to a daughter, Medora, who was widely rumoured to be Byron's child. The guilt and the terror of discovery began to consume him. He knew that if the truth were exposed, he would be utterly destroyed, ostracized from society, and potentially forced to flee the country. Desperate to save himself from the abyss, Byron decided that he needed to reform. He needed a respectable, stabilizing force in his life. He needed a wife. He turned his attentions to Annabella Milbank, a wealthy, highly educated, and deeply moral young woman. Annabella was the antithesis of the passionate, erratic women Byron usually pursued. She was a student of mathematics and astronomy, whom Byron affectionately and somewhat mockingly called his Princess of Parallelograms. Annabella had initially rejected Byron's proposal in 1812, recognizing his volatile nature. But Byron, driven by a perverse desire to conquer her virtue and secure his own salvation, persisted. He believed that her moral purity could somehow cleanse his own corrupted soul. Annabella, for her part, suffered from the dangerous illusion that she could save the wicked Lord Byron. In September 1814, she finally accepted his second proposal. They were married on January 2nd, 1815. It was a disaster from the very first day. As they rode away in their carriage for their honeymoon, which Byron bitterly referred to as a treacle moon, his behaviour was erratic and cruel. He reportedly told his terrified new bride that he had married her out of spite and that she would live to regret it. The marriage quickly descended into a nightmare of emotional abuse, financial ruin, and heavy drinking. Byron's debts had caught up with him. Bailiffs practically lived in their London home, seizing their furniture and threatening him with debtor's prison. The stress exacerbated his drinking and his violent temper. He would fly into terrifying rages, smashing objects and threatening Annabella. He also continued his relationship with Augusta, insisting that she stay with them in London, creating a deeply uncomfortable and toxic dynamic. He would openly flaunt his affection for his half-sister, tormenting Annabella with cruel hints about the true nature of their bond. Despite the misery, Annabella became pregnant. On December 10, 1815, she gave birth to a daughter, Augusta Ada Byron, who would later become famous as Ada Lovelace, a pioneer of early computer science. Byron's reaction to the birth was characteristically dramatic and unhelpful. He was disappointed it was not a boy, and his behavior toward Annabella grew even more erratic. He began to speak of suicide and madness, terrifying his wife to the point where she genuinely feared for her life and the safety of her child. In January 1816, just weeks after Ada's birth, Annabella took the baby and left London to visit her parents in the country. It was supposed to be a temporary visit, but once she was safely away from Byron, she confided the full horror of her marriage to her parents and her lawyers. She requested a legal separation. When the news of the separation broke, London society, which had so recently worshipped Byron, turned on him with a vicious, hypocritical fury. The rumours that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly exploded into the open. Whispers of incest with Augusta, allegations of sodomy, a capital offence, and tales of his brutal treatment of Annabella circulated through the drawing rooms and the press. He was transformed overnight from a literary idol into a social pariah. Byron was stunned by the speed and the brutality of his fall from grace. He found himself shunned at social events, cut dead by former friends in the street. The press attacked him mercilessly. He realised that his position in England was untenable. He was facing financial ruin, social annihilation, and the very real threat of legal prosecution. On April 25, 1816, Lord Byron signed the deed of separation. A few days later, on April the 24th, he boarded a ship at Dover and left England forever. He was 28 years old. As the white cliffs of Dover faded into the distance, he was a broken man, an exile driven from his homeland by a scandal of his own making. Yet this bitter exile would prove to be the catalyst for his greatest and most enduring poetry. As we move into Chapter 5, we will follow Byron to the shores of Lake Geneva, where a fateful meeting with Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary Godwin would lead to a summer of ghosts, the creation of Frankenstein, and the rebirth of the Byronic hero in the magnificent third canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. His journey began with a slow, melancholic progression through Belgium and up the Rhine River. He visited the battlefield of Waterloo, where Napoleon had been defeated just a year earlier. The sight of the still-scarred earth profoundly moved him, reinforcing his sense of the tragic futility of human ambition and the destructive power of history. These reflections would soon find their way into his poetry. But for now, he was a man adrift, seeking a sanctuary where he could escape the relentless scrutiny of the British press. In late May, Byron arrived in Switzerland and settled on the shores of Lake Geneva. He rented the Villa Diodati, a grand, imposing house with sweeping views of the lake and the distant, snow-capped Alps. It was here, in this dramatic setting, that one of the most famous and consequential literary gatherings in history would take place. Shortly after his arrival, Byron was introduced to another exiled English poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Shelley, though not yet as famous as Byron, was a brilliant radical thinker who had also fled England due to scandal. He had abandoned his pregnant wife to elope with the 18-year-old Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley. Accompanying Percy and Mary was Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont. Claire Clairmont was a crucial, often overlooked catalyst for this meeting. Before Byron had left London, Claire, a bold and ambitious young woman, had aggressively pursued him, eventually initiating a brief, passionate affair. She was now pregnant with Byron's child, a fact she had kept hidden from him until they were reunited in Geneva. Byron was irritated by her presence and her demands, but he was intensely drawn to the intellectual companionship of Percy Shelley. The two poets, despite their differing temperaments, Byron the cynical, brooding aristocrat, and Shelley the idealistic, ethereal radical, formed an immediate and profound bond. They spent their days sailing on the lake, exploring the surrounding mountains, and engaging in deep philosophical conversations that stretched late into the night. Shelley's idealism challenged Byron's deep-seated pessimism, while Byron's worldly experience grounded Shelley's more abstract theories. The summer of 1816, however, was not a typical summer. It became known as the Year Without a Summer. The massive eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the previous year had cast a veil of volcanic ash across the globe, causing severe climate abnormalities. In Geneva, the weather was atrocious. Relentless, freezing rain and spectacular violent thunderstorms kept the group confined indoors at the Villa Diodati for days on end. To pass the time during these dark, stormy days, the group read aloud from a collection of German ghost stories. The atmosphere in the villa, lit by flickering candles and surrounded by the howling wind, was thick with Gothic tension. It was in this environment that Byron made a famous proposal. We will each write a ghost story. The challenge was accepted. Byron began a story about a vampire, which he soon abandoned, though his physician John Polidori, who was also present, later developed the fragment into the vampire, the first modern vampire story in English literature. Percy Shelley wrote a short, unremarkable tale. But it was the 18-year-old Mary Godwin who produced the masterpiece of the competition. Inspired by a waking nightmare and the group's discussions about galvanism and the reanimation of corpses, she conceived the story of a brilliant scientist who creates a monstrous creature and is subsequently destroyed by it. Her story, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, would become one of the most enduring and influential novels of the 19th century. While Mary was creating her monster, Byron was undergoing a profound creative rebirth of his own. The pain of his exile, the majestic, terrifying beauty of the Alps, and the intellectual stimulation of his friendship with Shelley coalesced into a surge of poetic inspiration. He returned to the poem that had made him famous, writing the magnificent third canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. In this new canto, the character of Childe Harold is almost entirely subsumed by the voice of Byron himself. The poem is a raw, agonizing confession of his own suffering, a meditation on the nature of genius and madness, and a passionate response to the sublime power of nature. He wrote of his exile, "I have not loved the world, nor the world me. I have not flattered its rank breath, nor bowed to its idolatries a patient knee." The third canto of Childe Harold elevated the Byronic hero from a mere brooding wanderer to a figure of tragic, almost mythic proportions. A man who is destroyed by the intensity of his own passions, but who refuses to submit to the petty morality of society. It was a masterpiece of romantic literature, confirming that his exile had not diminished his genius, but rather deepened and darkened it. During this period, Byron also wrote The Prisoner of Chillon, a powerful narrative poem inspired by a visit to the Château de Chillon, a medieval fortress on the lake where a Swiss patriot had been imprisoned for years. The poem is a harrowing exploration of isolation, endurance, and the psychological toll of captivity, themes that resonated deeply with Byron's own sense of being trapped by his past and his reputation. As the summer drew to a close, the intense, claustrophobic dynamic at the Villa Diodati began to fracture. Byron's irritation with Claire Claremont's constant presence and her demands regarding their unborn child grew unbearable. In late August, the Shelleys and Claire departed for England. Byron was relieved to see Claire go, though he agreed to provide for the child, a daughter named Allegra, who would be born the following year. Left alone in Switzerland, Byron's melancholy returned. The intellectual companionship of Shelley was gone, replaced by the haunting memories of his disastrous marriage and his separation from Augusta. He realized that the majestic scenery of the Alps could not cure the sickness in his soul. He needed a new distraction, a new environment where he could lose himself in the sensual pleasures of the world. In October 1816, Byron packed his belongings and crossed the Alps into Italy. He was heading for Venice, a city of masks, canals, and legendary decadence. As we move into Chapter 6, we will see how Byron embraced the intoxicating, corrupt atmosphere of Venice, plunging into a life of spectacular excess, while simultaneously producing his greatest, most subversive masterpiece, the epic satire Don Juan. In November 1816, Lord Byron arrived in Venice, a city that seemed perfectly designed to match his own decaying grandeur and insatiable appetites. Venice was a city of masks, canals, and faded glory, a place where the rigid moral codes of English society held no sway. For a man fleeing scandal and seeking oblivion, it was paradise. "It is a poetical place," he wrote to his publisher, John Murray, "and classical to us from Shakespeare and Otway." But Byron was not there merely to admire the architecture, he was there to lose himself. He rented an apartment in the house of a draper and immediately embarked on a passionate affair with his landlord's wife, Mariana Sagatti. Mariana was beautiful, fiery, and entirely unconcerned with the intellectual pursuits that had characterized Byron's previous liaisons. She offered him a simple, uncomplicated, sensual pleasure that he found immensely relieving. This affair marked the beginning of a period of spectacular debauchery that would define his years in Venice. Byron threw himself into the Venetian carnival season with reckless abandon. He attended endless balls, masquerades, and theatrical performances, often staying out until dawn and sleeping until the late afternoon. He became a familiar figure on the Grand Canal, rowing his own gondola or swimming for miles in the lagoon. He also began to frequent the ridotti, the small private gambling and socializing rooms where the true, unvarnished life of Venice took place. His physical appearance began to change. The pale, ethereal youth who had captivated London society was replaced by a heavier, more robust figure. He let his hair grow long and adopted a flamboyant, almost theatrical style of dress. He was no longer the brooding Childe Harold. He was a Venetian libertine, reveling in the corruption and the freedom of his adopted city. In 1817, his life became even more complicated with the arrival of his illegitimate daughter Allegra. Claire Clairmont, unable to care for the child herself and hoping to force Byron into a relationship, had sent Allegra to him in Venice. Byron, who still harbored a deep resentment toward Claire, refused to see her, but agreed to take responsibility for the child. He placed Allegra in the care of a local family, and later, controversially, in a convent, a decision that would have tragic consequences. Despite the chaos of his personal life, Byron's literary output during this period was astonishing. He completed the fourth and final canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a magnificent meditation on the ruins of Rome and the enduring power of art. He also wrote Manfred, another dark, brooding tale of a guilt-ridden hero, which sold an incredible 20,000 copies on its first day of publication. But it was in Venice that Byron found his true, mature voice. He abandoned the melancholic Spenserian stanzas of Childe Harold and adopted the ottava rima, a flexible 8-line stanza form used by Italian Renaissance poets. This form allowed him to shift effortlessly between high poetry, biting satire, and conversational digression. The result was his masterpiece, the epic poem Don Juan. Don Juan was a radical departure from everything Byron had written before. Instead of the legendary, unrepentant seducer of Spanish folklore, Byron's Juan is a passive, innocent young man who is constantly seduced by the women he encounters. The poem is a sprawling, picaresque adventure that takes Juan from Spain to a Greek island, to the slave markets of Constantinople, to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia, and finally to the hypocritical high society of England. But the true genius of Don Juan lies not in its plot, but in its narrator. The narrator is Byron himself, cynical, worldly, hilarious, and devastatingly observant. He uses the poem to attack everything he despised: the hypocrisy of English society, the tyranny of kings, the brutality of war, and the pretensions of his fellow poets, particularly the Lake poets like Wordsworth and Southey, whom he considered dull and reactionary. When the first 2 cantos of Don Juan were published anonymously in 1819, the reaction in England was explosive. The public was shocked by its bawdiness, its irreverence, and its relentless mocking of sacred cows. The critics condemned it as immoral and dangerous. Even his publisher John Murray and his closest friends begged him to suppress it. But Byron refused. He knew he had created something extraordinary. "I have no plan," he wrote of the poem. "I had no plan, but I had, or have, materials. You are too earnest and eager about a work never intended to be serious. Do you suppose that I could have any intention but to giggle and make giggle?" While Don Juan was causing a sensation in England, Byron's life in Venice was reaching a crescendo of excess. He moved into the Palazzo Mocenigo, a grand, decaying palace on the Grand Canal, where he established a bizarre and chaotic household. He kept a menagerie of animals, including dogs, cats, monkeys, a fox, and even a wolf. He also maintained a rotating cast of mistresses, drawn from the lower classes of Venetian society. The most famous of these was Margherita Cogni, a fierce, illiterate baker's wife whom Byron called La Fornerina. Margherita was fiercely possessive and prone to violent, jealous rages. She once threw herself into the Grand Canal in a fit of pique, and on another occasion she attacked Byron with a knife. Their relationship was a tempestuous, exhausting battle of wills that eventually ended when Byron, fearing for his safety, forced her to leave the palazzo. By the end of 1818, the relentless debauchery was beginning to take its toll. Byron was exhausted, overweight, and suffering from various ailments, including a recurring fever that he had contracted in Greece years earlier. He realized that his life in Venice, while initially liberating, had become a destructive trap. He was 30 years old, but he felt like an old man. He wrote to a friend, "I am at present in a state of great exhaustion. I have been living too hard." He needed a change, a reason to pull himself out of the mire of Venetian decadence. That reason arrived in the spring of 1819, in the form of a young, beautiful, and married Italian noblewoman. Her name was Teresa Guiccioli, and she would become the last great love of his life, pulling him away from the brothels of Venice and plunging him into the dangerous, exhilarating world of Italian revolutionary politics. As we move into Chapter 7, we will explore Byron's transformative relationship with Teresa Guiccioli, his involvement with the secret society known as the Carbonari, and his evolution from a cynical poet into a committed political activist. Teresa was beautiful, passionate, and married to a wealthy, much older man, Count Alessandro Guiccioli. When Byron met her at a Venetian conversazione, the attraction was immediate and overwhelming. Unlike the fiery, illiterate women he had been consorting with, Teresa was educated, refined, and deeply romantic. She offered him something he had not experienced since his disastrous marriage, a connection that was both intellectual and intensely emotional. Their affair began almost immediately, and it was conducted with a startling lack of discretion. In the complex social world of 19th century Italy, it was not uncommon for a married noblewoman to have a recognized lover known as a cavalier servente. Byron eagerly adopted this role, becoming Teresa's constant companion. He followed her to her husband's estates in Ravenna and Bologna, effectively moving into the Guiccioli household. For Byron, this relationship was transformative. Teresa provided him with a sense of stability and domesticity that he had craved but never successfully achieved. Under her influence, he abandoned the chaotic, promiscuous lifestyle of Venice. He stopped drinking heavily, lost weight, and regained much of his former vitality. He wrote to his friend Douglas Kinnaird, "I am in love, and my love is returned. I have found my last attachment." But Teresa brought more than just romantic stability into Byron's life. She also introduced him to the dangerous, exhilarating world of Italian revolutionary politics. Teresa's family, the Gambas, were deeply involved with the Carbonari, a secret society dedicated to overthrowing the oppressive Austrian rule in northern Italy and establishing a unified, independent Italian republic. Byron, who had always harbored radical political sympathies, was immediately drawn to their cause. He saw in the Carbonari a chance to translate his poetic ideals of liberty and defiance into actual physical action. He became an active member of the society, using his wealth and his fame to support their efforts. He bought weapons, stored ammunition in his palazzo, and helped to organize local uprisings. This involvement was incredibly dangerous. The Austrian secret police were everywhere, and the penalty for treason was death or imprisonment in the notorious fortress of Spielberg. Byron knew the risks, but he embraced them with a characteristic mix of fatalism and bravado. He wrote in his journal, "It is not one man nor a million, but the spirit of liberty which must be spread. The Italians are a noble people, and they shall be free." During this period of intense political activity, Byron's literary output continued unabated, but its tone shifted. He continued to write Don Juan, producing some of its most brilliant and biting cantos, but he also turned his attention to historical dramas. He wrote plays like Marino Faliero, Sardanapalus, and The Two Foscari, which explored themes of political corruption, rebellion, and the tragic consequences of absolute power. These plays were less successful than his poetry, but they reflected his growing preoccupation with the realities of political struggle. The year 1821 brought a series of crises. The planned Carbonari uprising in the Romagna region, which Byron had helped to organize, ended in a disastrous failure before it even began. The Austrian authorities cracked down brutally, arresting hundreds of suspected conspirators. Teresa's father and brother were forced into exile, and Byron, though not arrested due to his status as a British peer, was strongly advised to leave the region. He followed the Gamba family to Pisa, and later to Genoa, where he established a new household. It was during this time that he suffered a profound personal tragedy. In 1822, his illegitimate daughter, Allegra, whom he had placed in a convent near Ravenna, died of a fever at the age of 5. Byron was devastated. He had kept his distance from the child, partly out of resentment toward her mother, Claire Claremont, but her death filled him with a deep, agonizing guilt. He arranged for her body to be sent back to England and buried in the churchyard at Harrow, near his childhood home. The death of Allegra cast a dark shadow over his life in Pisa. He sought solace in the company of a small circle of English expatriates, including Percy Bysshe Shelley, who had also settled in the area. The two poets resumed their intense intellectual friendship, spending their days sailing on the Mediterranean and discussing literature and politics. But tragedy struck again in July 1822. Shelley, sailing his boat, the Don Juan, was caught in a sudden, violent storm off the coast of Livorno and drowned. His body washed ashore days later, badly decomposed. Byron was present when Shelley's body was cremated on the beach, a gruesome pagan ceremony that deeply traumatized him. He wrote of Shelley, "He was the best and least selfish man I ever knew." The loss of Shelley, combined with the failure of the Italian Revolution and the death of Allegra, left Byron feeling increasingly isolated and disillusioned. His relationship with Teresa, while still affectionate, had settled into a comfortable, almost marital routine that chafed against his restless nature. He was 35 years old, wealthy, famous, and profoundly bored. He needed a new cause, a new arena where he could test himself and perhaps find the heroic destiny that had always eluded him. He began to look eastward, toward Greece, where a brutal war of independence was raging against the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks, fighting for their freedom against overwhelming odds, captured his imagination. It was a cause that combined his love of classical antiquity with his passionate belief in liberty. In the spring of 1823, Byron made a momentous decision. He would leave Italy, leave Teresa, and travel to Greece to join the fight for independence. It was a decision that would seal his fate and secure his immortal legacy. As we move into Chapter 8, we will follow Byron on his final tragic journey to Missolonghi, where the poet would attempt to become a soldier and where the Byronic hero would finally meet his end. In July 1823, Lord Byron boarded the Hercules, a sturdy but slow-moving ship he had chartered, and set sail from Genoa. He was leaving behind Italy, his mistress Teresa Guiccioli, and the life of a celebrated poet. Ahead of him lay Greece, a country locked in a brutal, chaotic struggle for independence against the Ottoman Empire. He was 35 years old, and he was sailing toward his destiny. The Greek War of Independence had begun in 1821, capturing the imagination of romantics across Europe. For Byron, Greece was not just a political cause. It was the cradle of Western civilization, the land of Homer and Socrates, a place he had idealized since his youth and immortalized in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. He had written, "The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. And musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free." Now he was determined to make that dream a reality. He arrived on the Ionian island of Cephalonia in August 1823. He did not rush headlong into battle. Instead, he spent several months on the island, carefully assessing the situation. What he found was deeply discouraging. The Greek forces were not a unified army of noble patriots. They were a fractured, squabbling collection of rival warlords, politicians, and bandits, often more interested in fighting each other for power and plunder than in fighting the Turks. Byron realized that his most valuable contribution would not be as a frontline soldier, but as a diplomat and a financier. He used his immense personal wealth. He had recently sold his ancestral home, Newstead Abbey, and had access to substantial funds to pay the arrears of the Greek sailors, preventing a mutiny that would have crippled the Greek fleet. He also worked tirelessly to mediate between the warring Greek factions, urging them to unite against their common enemy. His presence in Greece was a massive propaganda victory for the independence movement. The fact that the most famous poet in the world had come to fight for their cause brought international attention and much-needed financial support from Philhellenic committees in London and across Europe. Byron was no longer just a poet. He was a symbol of liberty. In December 1823, Byron finally crossed over to the Greek mainland, arriving in the town of Missolonghi. His arrival was greeted with wild enthusiasm. He was welcomed with a 21-gun salute and hailed as a savior. He was appointed commander-in-chief of the Greek forces in western Greece, a title that carried immense prestige but little actual authority. Missolonghi was a miserable, swampy town, surrounded by stagnant lagoons and plagued by malaria. It was the dead of winter, and the conditions were appalling. It rained constantly, turning the unpaved streets into rivers of mud. Byron, who had grown accustomed to the comforts of Italian palazzos, found himself living in a damp, drafty house, surrounded by a chaotic retinue of Suliote soldiers, fierce, unruly mercenaries whom he had taken into his personal pay. Despite the grim surroundings, Byron threw himself into his new role with surprising energy and pragmatism. He organized the defenses of the town, drilled his unruly troops, and planned an attack on the Turkish fortress of Lepanto. He also demonstrated a remarkable humanity, using his own money to ransom Turkish prisoners of war and ensure their safe passage home. An act of mercy that was rare in a conflict characterized by horrific atrocities on both sides. However, the strain of his responsibilities, the constant squabbling of the Greek leaders, and the atrocious climate of Missolonghi began to take a severe toll on his health. He was suffering from recurring fevers, likely malaria, and he was plagued by a deep, lingering melancholy. He missed Teresa, he missed his daughter Ada, and he began to suspect that his grand adventure might end in failure. On January 22nd, 1824, his 36th birthday, he wrote what would be one of his final poems, "On this day I complete my 36th year." It is a stark, unsentimental assessment of his life and his impending death. He wrote, "My days are in the yellow leaf. The flowers and fruits of love are gone. The worm, the canker, and the grief are mine alone." Yet the poem ends not in despair, but in a resolute call to action, a determination to die a soldier's death. Seek out, less often sought than found, a soldier's grave for thee the best. Then look around and choose thy ground and take thy rest. In February 1824, Byron suffered a severe convulsive fit, likely a symptom of his worsening malaria or perhaps a minor stroke. His doctors, adhering to the medical practices of the time, insisted on bleeding him. Byron, who had a deep-seated fear of being bled, initially resisted, but eventually relented. The repeated bleedings severely weakened him, draining him of the strength he needed to fight off the infection. Despite his declining health, he continued to work. He finalized the plans for the attack on Lepanto, but the expedition was repeatedly delayed by bad weather, lack of supplies, and the mutinous behavior of his Suliote troops. The frustration and the constant delays exacerbated his illness. By April, the heavy rains returned to Missolonghi, turning the town into a fetid swamp. On April 9th, Byron went for a ride on horseback and was caught in a torrential downpour. He returned home soaked to the skin and shivering violently. The fever returned with a vengeance. For the next 10 days, Byron lay in his damp bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. His doctors, panicked and incompetent, continued to bleed him, applying leeches to his temples and blistering his skin. The cure was undoubtedly hastening his death. In his lucid moments, he spoke of his daughter Ada, his sister Augusta, and his beloved Greece. He reportedly muttered, "I have given her my time, my means, my health, and now I give her my life. What could I do more?" As the news of his grave illness spread through Missolonghi, a heavy silence fell over the town. The Suliote soldiers, who had so often frustrated him, gathered outside his house, weeping openly. The man who had come to save them was dying. On the evening of April 19th, 1824, during a violent thunderstorm that seemed to echo the dramatic turbulence of his life, George Gordon, Lord Byron, died. He was 36 years old. The news of his death sent shockwaves across Europe. In Greece, he was mourned as a national hero. In England, the society that had exiled him was suddenly struck by a profound sense of loss. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, then a young boy, famously carved into a rock, "Byron is dead," feeling that the world had suddenly grown dark. Byron had not died on the battlefield, as he had hoped. He had died of a fever in a miserable swamp, killed as much by his doctors as by the disease. Yet his death achieved what his life could not. It galvanized international support for the Greek cause, ultimately leading to the intervention of the great powers and the establishment of an independent Greek state. As we move into the final chapter, Chapter 9, we will examine the immediate aftermath of his death, the bizarre and gruesome journey of his remains back to England, the destruction of his memoirs, and the enduring immortal legacy of the man who defined the Romantic Age. In Greece, the reaction was immediate and profound. A 37-day period of national mourning was declared. The Greek provisional government recognized that Byron's death was a more powerful weapon than any army he could have commanded. His martyrdom galvanized international sympathy for the Greek War of Independence, turning a localized rebellion into a pan-European crusade. The Philhellenic movement surged, bringing vital funds, volunteers, and eventually the decisive military intervention of Britain, France, and Russia, which secured Greek independence at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. To this day, Byron is revered as a national hero in Greece, where the name Byron remains popular. The immediate aftermath of his death, however, was marked by a gruesome and bizarre series of events. Byron had explicitly requested that his body not be returned to England, a country he felt had hypocritically exiled him. He had asked to be buried in Greece or perhaps in Italy near his beloved Teresa Guiccioli, but his wishes were ignored. His body was embalmed by local doctors in a crude and hasty procedure. His heart, brain, and intestines were removed and placed in separate urns, which were intended to remain in Missolonghi as relics. The rest of his body was placed in a barrel of spirits. Some accounts say rum, others say brandy, to preserve it for the long journey back to England. The journey of Byron's remains was a macabre spectacle. The ship carrying his body, the Florida, arrived in London in July 1824. The English establishment, which had so viciously turned on him 8 years earlier, was now faced with the awkward problem of what to do with the corpse of its most famous and most scandalous son. The Dean of Westminster Abbey flatly refused to allow Byron to be buried in Poets' Corner, citing his questionable morality and his open defiance of religious orthodoxy. It was a final, petty insult from the society he had so brilliantly mocked in Don Juan. Instead, his body was transported north to Nottinghamshire, to the family vault in the small church of St. Mary Magdalene in Hucknall Torkard, near his ancestral home of Newstead Abbey. The funeral procession from London to Nottinghamshire was a massive, spontaneous outpouring of public grief. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the hearse pass. It was a testament to the enduring power of his poetry and the magnetic pull of his legend, a legend that transcended the scandals that had forced him into exile. But the most shocking event following Byron's death did not involve his body. It involved his words. During his years in Italy, Byron had written a detailed, candid memoir of his life. He had given the manuscript to his friend, the poet Thomas Moore, with the understanding that it would be published after his death. Moore had subsequently sold the publication rights to John Murray, Byron's longtime publisher, for the staggering sum of 2,000 guineas. When news of Byron's death reached London, a frantic debate erupted over the fate of the memoirs. Byron's half-sister, Augusta Lee, and his estranged wife, Annabella Milbank, were terrified of what the memoirs might contain. They feared that Byron had documented his incestuous relationship with Augusta, his brutal treatment of Annabella, and his numerous homosexual affairs. They pressured John Murray and Byron's close friend, John Cam Hobhouse, to destroy the manuscript. On May 17, 1824, in the drawing room of John Murray's publishing house at 50 Albemarle Street, a group of Byron's friends and representatives gathered. Despite the protests of Thomas Moore, who argued that the memoirs should be preserved for posterity, the decision was made. The manuscript, the only copy of Byron's own account of his extraordinary life, was torn apart and thrown into the fireplace. The destruction of Byron's memoirs is considered one of the greatest literary crimes in history. It was an act of censorship driven by fear and Victorian prudery, an attempt to sanitize the legacy of a man who had spent his life defying convention. But the flames that consumed his memoirs could not destroy his legend. If anything, the mystery surrounding the burned pages only added to the dark, tantalizing allure of the Byronic myth.